So welcome to week 9. You're going to be very pleased to know that the presentation this week is quite short. And it's quite short in part because it's difficult to know how to speak about a concept such as dignity. Dignity is very abstract, it's very individual, it's highly influenced by our values and beliefs and our boundaries that we set for ourselves. And so, as I mentioned in my introductory comments in the posting, is that a lot of the work that we do as nurses around dignity requires us to really pay attention to self-awareness and self-knowledge. So while we have an agenda and we have goals and objectives for this week, just as we do for the other weeks, I can't stress enough how important it is for you to think for yourself about dignity and to really develop ethical sensitivity to explore situations that could potentially harm or threaten another person's dignity or your own. There are many considerations for dignity, whether it is something that can be taken away from us or whether it is something that resides within us that no one can take away. But as you'll see in the upcoming few comments that I make, as nurses, we tend to think that dignity is something that needs to be preserved. In this, we recognize that we recognize that within the healthcare system and within the illness experience, there are many opportunities for dignity to be threatened. And so having a sophisticated ethical sensitivity to be aware of the intended and unintended effects of our actions and behaviors and attitudes is quite key to being able to do the work of preserving dignity. So for this week, there are 8 things that we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to examine the concept of dignity and as best we can to understand it. We're trying to understand and examine our own individual values, principles, and beliefs that support or detract from our practice of preserving dignity. And it's important to explore the context in which healthcare is provided, how the institutional organization of nurses' work influences our ability to preserve dignity, or in fact creates conditions that makes it difficult for us. So we need to look at strategies as nurses that we can use to preserve an individual's dignity and strategies that we can use to organize our work in such a way that our actions have these unintended consequences. Then we're going to discuss some of the readings. This week I chose to have readings particularly around truth-telling, lying, and deception because I think this is one of the concrete ways that we can think about dignity and think about our actions as nurses. And it's one of the micro-sociological practices that we have that gives us a way in to explore this concept. I considered whether we should just stay really abstract with dignity, but decided to take this route. And you can tell me in our forum discussions how that's going for you. So what is dignity? How does a person maintain dignity? And why is dignity important? Obviously, if it's one of the CNA value statements, it's been decided by nurses across the country that dignity is a central concept to nursing and to nursing care and to the patient's experience. But it's very difficult to define, and it's very difficult to fully understand what it is. Sometimes we understand dignity better when it's absent, when we talk about an undignified act, or if we become indignant over something. I think that if we were to each write a definition of dignity and why it's important, I think that we would see some patterns and themes, but I think we would also note some differences. So some of the work, as I mentioned, is really individual work for this week, trying to develop your self-knowledge and your self-awareness about your own ideas vis-a-vis dignity. So as I mentioned, nurses across Canada felt that dignity was so important to nursing that the CNA Code of Ethics created a value statement about it, preserving dignity. And so the CNA stand on human dignity, which is really nurses across Canada's stand, is that the preservation of human dignity is a responsibility of the registered nurse, and that all patients have the right to be treated with dignity. And this includes patients regardless of what they have done or who they are. So the pedophile is just as worthy to be treated in a dignified manner as the most self-sacrificing person that we know. The CNA stand also asks us to recognize that there is a potential for loss of dignity in healthcare, and that we are obliged, both morally and ethically, to endeavor to prevent the loss of dignity. So in a first step, then, it requires us to have an ethical sensitivity to recognize situations where perhaps dignity is threatened. I mentioned a moment ago that dignity and worth seem to be connected. If we go back to the quote of Aristotle, who said, "Dignity does not come in possessing honors, but in deserving them." However, we can contest some of that. And I think as nurses, we're asked to really challenge this notion and to recognize that just because we are human, we are worthy of dignity. So dignity is viewed as a universal phenomena, that all people have worth and value because we share the human genome. Dignity is subjective and is based on a person's idea of it. However, it is still a universal principle. Kant's humanity formula, for example, gives us a bit of direction. Treat others as an end and not merely as a means to an end requires us to recognize the humanity and moral worth of each person. So we can't trot upon people because they are dignified. So when we try to understand dignity and we try to do our work around self-awareness and self-knowledge, we start to recognize that our sense of dignity is sometimes connected to our sense of self-worth. How we think about and attach value to ourselves and how we see ourselves as a whole person influences the boundaries that we have around dignity. I mentioned earlier that the Canadian Nurses Association asks us to recognize that the healthcare institution, the illness process, the illness trajectory, and the situations in which people find themselves can threaten dignity. So we see this for many instances, and again, we could have quite a lengthy discussion about situations that threaten dignity, but we know that when people cannot meet their own needs, there is a potential for their dignity to be threatened. When people can't get themselves to the washroom, when people can't feed themselves, can't dress themselves, can't make their own decisions, dignity can be threatened. John Stuart Mill says, "Everyone is degraded, whether aware of it or not, when other people, without consulting him, take upon themselves unlimited power to regulate his destiny." So we can see how that first issue of how dignity can be threatened when a person cannot meet his or her own needs. Technology can also threaten a person's dignity when we see the machine and not the person. So for example, when we go into a patient's room and we only look at their IV pump and their monitors and not look at them as a person, that threatens their dignity. Another area are the power imbalances that can create vulnerability. We know that healthcare providers can sometimes overuse the power that they have inherent in their professional status. Here's another one of those tables that I create for you to help you study or to help you consider a bunch of ideas all at once. I think that this table is not intended to tell you how to think about something, but rather to give you some ideas of some of the common or popular discourses that influence all of our abilities to think about dignity. But I think central is the idea that dignity is a very individualized concept. One of the sources of ideas and the ways to consider dignity that I particularly like and find helpful to me in my nursing work are the relational ideas, that dignity arises from events that happen between two people. I particularly like the mirror analogy. That's read in the second paragraph on page 169 from the textbook. In this, we can see that what we give back to people can either affirm or disaffirm their experience and their sense of self-worth. So I find those positions to be quite helpful to me. But of course, you need to come to understand this in your own way. So as you can see, dignity is not just important to nurses. Some of the great ethics scholars have had specific ideas on dignity, attesting again to the notion that dignity is a concept for ethical practice. So if we look at Kant's idea, we can see that it's a basic characteristic of humans because we have the ability to reason. Kant saw dignity as linked to autonomy and self-determination, but Kant suggested that dignity could never be lost, it could never be taken away. This view, as you know now, is not consistent with our code of ethics, in that the code of ethics states that people can lose dignity and that it needs to be preserved. The utilitarian view is that humans are sentient beings, and we respond emotionally as well as intellectually. And because we have the ability to respond emotionally, it tells us that we can experience suffering, which means that we have dignity. This approach, the utilitarian approach, helps us to see that there is a link between feelings and dignity and our obligation to respond. Some of the ideas from the utilitarian view connect for me to the relational view, and that it's what happens in between the two people that can affirm or disaffirm value and worth. One of the challenges with the utilitarian view, however, is that it could lead us to believe that a person in a vegetative state does not have dignity. And we would say as nurses that all people, because we share the human genome, have dignity. Lastly, Aristotle's view speaks to the fact that dignity gave status or rank, and that living with dignity has to do with the ability to execute plans, fulfill social roles, and independence. So if dignity is linked to our thoughts and our abilities to think and to our character, it leads to the view that we may question whether somebody who has disabilities could still be dignified. And so Aristotle's view is sometimes critiqued for this reason. However, all of these different perspectives on dignity don't necessarily tell us specifically how to think about it, because I think we know by now that it's a very nebulous and abstract concept, but it gives us a little bit of opening and a few different perspectives to consider dignity for ourselves. So what does this all mean for us as nurses? What are the implications for practice? And I think that for me, some of the takeaway messages that I get from the course readings and from my understanding of dignity is that we cannot take it for granted. Whether it is something that resides within the person or not, it is still such an important concept that we need to pay attention to it. We need to have sensitivity to situations that could be threatening a person's dignity, and that we need to recognize that it is a very individual concept, and we need to have discussions with our patients, and we need to be very attuned to the unintentional consequences of our actions or inactions. So dignity, I see as central to the nurse-patient relationship. We really must guard against any practice that objectifies a patient. And in that, we would then privilege the lived experience and the person's own unique experience with health and illness. And for us to spend time truly getting to know our patients so that we understand the patient's values, their context, their lives, and their stories. And when we express interest in the patient as a unique human being, uniquely living his or her health situation, we can help to preserve a person's dignity or certainly not hinder it. So I'm not sure if my little comments about dignity are helpful, but I think that as we work through the discussion forum and as we help each other understand dignity more fully, I'm hoping that we come to some deeper understanding of what this means for us as nurses. So I'm wondering, what issues of dignity have you encountered? When have you felt that somebody's dignity may be threatened? Or what actions have you taken to preserve the dignity of another person? Have there been instances in your work as a student nurse where you felt indignant? Because when those emotions rise up, as the utilitarian view suggests, because we have the ability to have emotional expressions and suffering, when we have those experiences of indignation, it suggests to us that perhaps we're in the midst of an experience that could be somehow influencing our dignity. So some questions that I would like to leave you with, because it's the theme that we have in this course, more questions than answers. I wonder, is the reason we pursue an ethical and moral practice is to preserve dignity, or does our pursuit of dignity cause us to pursue an ethical and moral practice? So please finish the readings if you haven't already, and join us in the discussion forums.